The Torah is broken up into 54 Torah portions in the traditional recitation. Some of these Torah portions are not that interesting. But in the book of Genesis, there's a lot of interesting material. It's almost like people who watch the first few episodes of the series and think that's what the whole series is going to be like, and they don't realize it doesn't always maintain that momentum all the way through. Well, the Torah is a little bit like that too. It has its openings and it has its slow periods. But this particular Torah portion for this week begins with a bang because it begins with movement. In fact, the name of it is Lekh-Lekha, go get going. And it's a story about migration, but it's also an origin story. In last week's Shabbat service, we looked at the portion called Noach, or about Noah, and that talked about the origin of the rainbow, and the origin of languages, and the origin of human dispersion, and the origin of getting drunk, because Noah was the first person to plant a vineyard and get drunk and fall down naked. And there's also perhaps the origin of shame for your parents, which probably is the origin of psychotherapy. So we have a lot of origin stories in that portion, but those are universal human origin stories. Now we're zeroing in on the origin story of one particular clan of people in that group. And we know that this character we're going to meet in chapter 12 is important because of his name. His name is Abram. It's not Abraham yet. We'll have to wait and see when that happens. But he begins as Abram. Why do we know he's important? What does the name mean? Av is father. Ram is exalted. Now, it's unlikely that his father named him Abram, knowing this is what he was going to turn into. We know that he's a stand-in character, or what's called an eponymous ancestor, someone that a later generation has claimed to be the founder of their dynasty. And we'll see why he's thought to be so important as we go through our Torah portion of this week. Now, traditionally, the Torah portions are broken up into 7 chunks, or aliyot, which would be a different person coming up to read a different part of the Torah portion. In this case, I've focused on 5 areas, 5 sections we're going to be discussing. Hopefully we'll get through all 5 in a reasonable time frame, because in the end, there are some things that are less interesting to us than they may be to others. So the story begins. The Hebrew God, Yahweh, or Yud-He-Vav-He, or Jehovah, or Adonai, if you're reading it traditionally, or Adoshem, if you want to be extra careful, or Hashem, if you want to be extra, extra, extra careful. There's a sense of a taboo around that name that you're not supposed to say it. But as we'll see, the fact that the name appears in this story becomes important in understanding the evolution of the text. So the Hebrew God Yahweh says to Abram, Lekh-Lekha, go yourself, or go with yourself, or really, really go, from the land of which you were born, and from the house of your father, to the land that I will show you. This actually becomes the basis of a song by Debbie Friedman, Lekh-Lekha, which is sometimes sung in Reformed congregations, but also in our own congregation as well. To leave the land of your birth, leave the house of your father, and go somewhere new. That is actually a radical statement in this time and place. You know, we are used to people moving far away from their parents. Well, maybe some of us are used to it. Some of us never get used to it. But the phenomenon of people moving far away from where they were born is unusual in human history. I remember they were doing a study of ancient genetics in England, and they had found a skeleton that dated back 8,000 years or something like that. And just for comparison, they tested the DNA of the people in the local town. And it turns out that one of the people living in the local town was a direct male line descendant of this person they had found buried 8,000 years ago. And part of you says, that's amazing. And part of you says, boy, that family is boring. Because they've been living in the same place for 8,000 years. In Jewish history, that would be almost unthinkable. So Abram leaving his home, going off to a new place, simply by the promise of a voice from who knows where, that is an unusual statement for this time and place. It's very usual for later Jewish history. And in fact, this is, again, an origin story for a people that have experienced exile, that are contemplating returning from exile from the very place that Abraham is living. He was born in Ur, which is in the south of Iraq. He's moved to Haran, which is in the north of Iraq. If you think about the Fertile Crescent in that map of the Middle East, going through the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, He's gone from the bottom end of the Persian Gulf up to the top, and now the promise is to go further down that Fertile Crescent. But to leave this land of civilization of what then is Babylonia, but will become Iraq, that is a statement of hope, but it's also a statement of hope to the people writing it, because they are living in Babylonia and hoping to return to that promised land, just as Abram does in their founding story. It is promised to Abraham, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. So you will be an ancestor. What a great thing to be. You get to become an ancestor. I will bless those who bless you and curse the ones who curse you. It's called protection, right? And all the families of the earth will bless themselves by you. And so Abraham did in fact leave as God had commanded him, and Lot, who is his nephew, and Lot's father has died, so he's sort of an adopted son into Abram's house, goes with him. And Abram is 75 years old when he left Haran. Again, a sign of faith, to leave your home when you're 75 years old. Although I guess in some cases, as people are aging, maybe this is a useful story for them. You know, Abram left his home when he was 75 years old, and maybe it's okay to move on to the next stage. So Abram took his wife Sarai, notice her name is a little bit different too, took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and all the wealth they had amassed and all the people they had acquired in Haran, literally the nephesh, the souls they had made. And actually some people interpret that as people they had converted, because it's like acquiring a new soul to acquire a new religious identity, and Abraham is seen as the prototype of the Hebrew monotheist. He becomes a prototype of the Muslim monotheist for Islam under the name Ibrahim, but he is also claimed that by Jews in the stories of Abraham. And so they set out for the land of Canaan. And when they arrived in the land of Canaan, he passed through the land as far as Shechem, which is sort of on the northern end of what today is the West Bank, and the Canaanites were already there. And Yahweh appeared to Abraham. Now this already is a clue of a problem, because are you allowed to see God? Well, other stories in the Bible would say, no, you can't look on God and live. But other strands will say, God appears to Abraham, and there's no problem. So this reflects, again, the diversity of ideas, ideologies, theologies that get combined into the Hebrew Bible that gets papered over when we call it the book, when it's actually not only the books in terms of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, but even the stories that have been melded together with differing strands and different ideologies. He's told, I will assign this land to you and your offspring, which of course to Abraham is hypothetical because he has no offspring of his own. And he built an altar there to Yahweh who appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country east of Bethel and pitched his tent there, and then he again built an altar and invoked Yahweh by name. Now this is an interesting detail, that he actually used Yahweh's name directly. In the book of Exodus, when Moses meets this same God at the burning bush, that God then says to Moses, my name is Yahweh, and your ancestors didn't know that name. Well, except this story clearly says that Abram knew that name and used that name. So again, you've got differing traditions that are being melded together, and sometimes there's some seams in that sewing together that aren't quite evenly stitched. So Abraham continues journeying by stages toward the Negev, which is the southern desert south of the hill country in the land of Israel. There was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to stay there. Does that sound familiar? Famine in the land, having to go down to Egypt, just like Joseph and his brothers. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. If the Egyptians see you and think she is his wife, they will kill me and let you live. Please say that you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you and I may remain alive thanks to you. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw how very beautiful the woman was. Pharaoh's courtiers saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's palace. And because of her it went well with Abraham. He acquired sheep, oxen, asses, male and female slaves, she-asses, and camels. What do you think was going on with Sarai at that time? She was taken into the Pharaoh's house, and Abram gets the payoff? I mean, what's going on here? But Yahweh afflicted Pharaoh and his household with mighty plagues. Literally, the Hebrew says, and he plagued them with plagues, which you can do in Hebrew more easily than in English, on account of Sarai, the wife of Abraham. And there's also a pun being made here, because the name Sarai means princess. Just like the Sarim, the courtiers of Pharaoh, went to find her, so there's a little linguistic play in the Hebrew there. But they're afflicted with mighty plagues on account of Sarai. In fact, the rabbinic commentary says that Pharaoh actually never touched Sarai in the palace because he was afflicted with a plague the minute she went in. And so he never had a chance to do what we imagine was being done in that setting. That's again rabbinic commentary trying to soften the story, but as we read it, it could be much more salacious. Pharaoh sent for Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife?" Now, it doesn't say here how Pharaoh figured it out. Maybe he had seers that could talk to the gods and find out what's this curse coming from. Maybe she gave it away. Maybe Abram gave it away at some point. In any case, Pharaoh goes on and says, "Why did you say, 'She is my sister, so I took her as my wife'? Now here is your wife. Take her and be gone." Notice here's someone else telling Abram, "Get going." But now it's get going out of Egypt. This is again prefiguring another future part of the story where the exodus from Egypt is going back to the promised land. And so Pharaoh actually put agents in charge of Abraham, and they sent him off with his wife and all he possessed. So in the end, it was a profitable stop for Abraham, right? He acquired property and slaves and gold and donkeys, and he got his wife back too. And so they make their way out back to the promised land. Now, what happened to Sarai? What did she think of all this? We don't get her voice in this part of the story. Abram says, "Do this." As far as we know, she does. What do you think about Abram's behavior here? Well, it's worth evaluating. Again, remember, the rabbinic commentaries want to make him the hero, want to make him without flaw. But if you think of it as literature, you might say, what is he doing putting his wife in front of him like a human shield, having her be his sister so that he stays alive and in the end he prospers in that territory, but we don't know what's happening to her in that place. Now, maybe this is a partnership. I saw a modern staging of the Shakespeare play, The Taming of the Shrew, which is a very anti-feminist play. But at the very end, they put something in actions that was not in the words, where they win the bet. The bet is that the shrew can be tamed by this strong man. And at the end, he gets the gold, and he throws it to her, and she laughs, because it was part of their plot. She was actually acting tame the whole time just to win the money. So that sort of redeems the anti-feminist language at the end of the play by the way you frame it. And so we could imagine that this is part of a plot that Sarai and Abram have hatched together, and in the end it works out, because the plague protects her, and he prospers, and then they leave and go back to the promised land, which is where they wanted to go in the first place. Well, as they come back toward the promised land, they go back up into the Negev, into that southern desert, with Abram and Sarai, his wife, and all that he possesses. And Abram is very rich in cattle, silver, and gold. He goes as far as Bethel, which is in the northern part of that eastern territories. Today we call it the West Bank. He pitched his tent between Bethel and Ai, two major cities, the site of the altar he had built there at first. And there again he invoked Yahweh by name. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds in tent. The land could not support them staying together. Not enough herding territory, not enough pasture land, simply not enough elbow room. They were jostling each other, and there was quarreling between the herders of Abram's cattle and those of Lot. And it reminds you, and this is again an indication it was written at a later time, the Canaanites and Perizzites were then dwelling in the land. In other words, not like now when we're writing it, So it'd be like when you start a program and you might say, this is the land that was formerly owned by the Anasazi peoples. That's what this is saying. This is a land that was formerly owned by the Canaanites and Perizzites, but not anymore. It's not as if it were written contemporaneous to this moment. Abraham says to Lot that there be no strife between you and your herders and mine, Is not the whole land before you? Let us separate. If you go north, I'll go south. Dividing the land to make peace? Fascinating. Jordan decided he wanted the whole plain of the Jordan. This was before Yahweh had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, foreshadowing later in the Abraham saga, all the way to Zoar, what today is the desert of the Dead Sea Rift Valley. Back then, it's imagined was a fertile garden place to be, and so Lot takes the fertile land, the whole plain of the Jordan, and journeyed eastward, and Abram remained in the land of Canaan, which is more of the hill country, more in the center of what is today the land of Israel. And Lot settled in the cities of the plain, pitching his tents near Sodom. Now the inhabitants of Sodom were very wicked sinners against Yahweh, but it doesn't say what they did. Now today we have a word in English, a sodomite or sodomy, which is homosexual male sex. We'll see that is part of the story of Sodom in the later chapters. But at this point it just says they were wicked, and it's not exactly clear what their wickedness was. Again, commentators come in to try to guess what it would be. It could be interpersonal cruelty, it could be avarice and greed, it could be violence. It depends on the commentator how they interpret the violence of Sodom and their sins. But again, we know it's going to be destroyed. It was even alluded to here in this chapter. If they were destroyed, they must have done something wrong. That's the cosmology of the Hebrew Bible. And so Abram now says, after Lot has parted, raise your eyes and look out from where you are, to the north and the south, to the east and the west. I give you all the land that you see, to you and your offspring forever. This is the concept of the promised land. I will make of your offspring as the dust of the earth. So if one could count the dust of the earth, your offspring too can be counted. Now, this doesn't mean that Abram is the ancestor of the Chinese or of India. Those are peoples that cannot be counted. The Hebrew people, as we do in censuses and surveys all the time, we can count us, not even on a scale comparable to the Chinese or to those of the Indian subcontinent. But this is the promise that was made, that your offspring will be great and numerous. Up, walk about the land, through its length and its breadth, for I give it to you. And this line jumped out at me today because I signed a certificate for our bat mitzvah tomorrow. It's a certificate towards a trip to Israel. And on the bottom of that certificate, the Jewish United Fund of Metropolitan Chicago has written this exact verse. Up, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I give it to you. It's again the idea of a promised land and inheritance for all time to the Hebrew people. Abram moved into his tent and came to dwell at the terebinths of Mamre, which are in Hebron. If you watch the news, that's still there today because the cave of the patriarchs, the tomb of Abram, when he becomes Abraham, and Sarah, as she becomes Sarah from Sarai, that's claimed to be in Hebron. And so it remains a point of conflict between Muslims and Jews because it's claimed, Ibrahim is claimed as the ancestor of both traditions. Now we're actually going to jump past chapter 14, which is about a war between Abram and 4 kings that take Lot as a hostage. We don't need to dive into that. And there is a Canaanite king who praises Abram in the name of Yahweh. That's a fascinating detail, but again, time is of the essence. So in chapter 15, another word of Yahweh comes to Abraham, and this time in a vision. And here, God is given another role. It's much more of a clear covenant, an agreement in 2 ways. Fear not, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be great. In fact, Magen Avraham, the shield of Abraham, is one of those appellations of God in Jewish tradition. But now Abraham decides to haggle a bit. O Lord Yahweh, what can you give me, seeing that I will die childless? You say I have these offspring. You're going to give me... I have no kids. The one in charge of my household is Damascus Eliezer, the Damascene, the person from Damascus, named Eliezer. He's going to take over because I have no kids. Since you've granted me no offspring, my steward will be my heir. What kind of status are you giving me here? The word of Yahweh came in reply. That one will not be your heir. None but your very own issue, the things that come out of your guts. What comes from you, that will be your heir. And in the vision, God took him outside and said, look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. So shall your offspring be. And so he trusted in God, and it was thought to him as tzedakah, as righteousness, as a merit. Having faith was promised, within the promises of God, is counted as one of Abraham's basic tenets. That's what makes, by the way, the binding of Isaac's story, which comes up in Genesis 22, that much more poignant, because he's been promised all these offspring. He's shown this wonderful faith. God gives him a son and then says, take the son and sacrifice him. And yet again, Abraham demonstrates his faith. It's why that story is so terrible, powerful, but also why it's brought in at the high holidays to remind people the value of faith in a traditional perspective. Then God said to him, now we're in verse 7, I am Yahweh who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to assign this land to you as a possession. Literally, lerishta means like to be able to bequeath it to someone else. It's a property you can hand off. And another fascinating detail here is it's called Ur of the Kasdim, Ur of the Chaldeans. Well, in the time of Abraham, it wasn't called Ur of the Chaldeans. The time of those Jews living in Babylon and the exile who were imagining a return, it was called Ur of the Chaldeans. So again, a clue of when this is being written. It's this wish fulfillment projected back into the early history of Abraham going from Mesopotamia to the Promised Land. Well, we're going to use the language people know. It's Ur of the Chaldeans, because there might have been other Urs after all anyways. And then Abraham, again, haggles. Maybe this is part of our desire to question things. O Lord Yahweh, how will I know that I am to possess it? What's the confirmation? Came the reply, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old she-goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young bird. He brought all these and cut them in half, placing each half opposite the other. He did not cut up the bird. Birds of prey came down on the carcass, and Abraham drove them away. As the sun was about to set, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a great dark dread descended upon him. And God said to Abraham, know well that your offspring will be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will execute judgment on the nation they shall serve, and in the end they shall go free with great wealth. Now what is he talking about there? Could be two things. It could be prefiguring the Exodus from Egypt, where they lived in Egypt and they were slaves for many years, and then they escaped with great wealth. But it could also be, again, that wish fulfillment of the writers, living in Babylonian exile and imagining a return to the Promised Land with prosperity. You see, living outside, coming home, it could work for either of these stories. And as for you, God promises, you shall go to your ancestors in peace, you shall be buried at a ripe old age, and they shall return here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. I need to make them worse so you are justified in kicking them out, basically. And when the sun set and it was very dark, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between those pieces. This is actually called the covenant of the pieces, where the animals are cut in half and the flame passes between them, and that's a sign of the agreement, because you've divided the life force in half and you've created a covenant. In fact, the word in Hebrew for to make a covenant is in this verse 18. Vayom hahu, in that day, karat Yahweh et Avraham brit. God cut a covenant with Abraham. So the cutting of the animals is in fact cutting a deal, right? We even say in English. To your offspring I will assign this land. And here's the geography of the perfect promise. From the river of Egypt, that's the Nile, to the great river, the river Euphrates. You know the map of the Middle East right now. If you own from the Nile to the Euphrates, that would include much of Egypt and a lot of Syria. It's not a plausible map. But there were some, at the great extent of modern Israeli success in the Six-Day War, when they were on the borders of Damascus and at the gates of the Nile, they were almost at that Promised Land border. And it may well be that this was in fact the borders of the greatest expansive kingdom the Hebrews ever had under King Solomon. And so now they're imagining this is what was promised to Abraham, this maximal kingdom of greater, greater, greater Israel. And it will include the peoples of the Canaanites and the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, all these peoples you will conquer, and their land will be yours. It's been promised and foretold. Now, an interesting question that some rabbis ask is, why doesn't the Bible start with this? The Abram story, right? Why go through God creating the world and God having the Tower of Babel and the flood and Adam and Eve and all? Why start with that? And the answer the rabbis gave to their own question was that if in the future the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Rephaim show up and say, "Who are you to take this land?" The answer is given. God made everything, so he gets to tell you when you're here and he gets to tell you when to get lost. Because this is ours, based on a promise. Now, that's not how politics works in most cases, but it is how religion works when it's tied to politics and claims to land and sovereignty. Now, here comes the fertility story, but it's not an easy one either. And this is actually the first time in the Hebrew Bible where we have two women relating to each other. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go particularly well. Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Look, Yahweh has kept me from bearing. Consort with my maid. Perhaps I shall have a child through her." And Abram heeded Sarai's request. And so Sarai, Abram's wife, took her maid, Hagar the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt in the land of Canaan for 10 years, and gave her to her husband Abraham as a concubine. It actually says in Hebrew, Isha, as a wife, or as a woman, because in Hebrew the word for wife and woman are the same. Now, some people read this story now and they say, wow, that sounds a lot like The Handmaid's Tale, either the TV show or the Margaret Atwood novel. But guess what? Guess where Margaret Atwood got it from? It's from here. In fact, if you read the novel, they quote this passage at a certain scene to make it obvious, the connection between the two. But the idea is that the maidservant does not have her own independent identity. She is the servant to the umpteenth degree of being a surrogate. Except once she successfully becomes pregnant, then it becomes a problem. Now, I do have to say that one of my favorite verbs in all of Hebrew is she became pregnant. Vayavo el Hagar, and he came upon Hagar in the biblical sense. V'tahar, and she became hilly, because a har is a hill. So beherayon is pregnancy, and it literally means you become hilly, you become like a hill. So it's a very evocative verb in the Hebrew. But when she realized that she had conceived, she then took lightly her mistress. In other words, she didn't respect Sarai anymore, because now who is going to be the mother of the heir to the whole household? Not Sarai. And even though it says that she was given as an Isha, as a woman, or as a wife even, to Abram, Sarai does not like the competition. And so what does she do? She blames Abram. The wrong done me is your fault. Chamasi alecha, my violence, what hurts me, is upon you. I myself put my maid in your bosom. Now she sees that she is pregnant. I am lowered in her esteem. Yahweh decide between me and you. And Abram said to Sarai, it's up to you. Your maid is in your hands. Deal with her as you think right. Abram doesn't come off pretty good in this story either. Then Sarai treated her harshly, and Hagar ran away. A messenger of Yahweh, and the word for messenger is malach, which also means angel, so it could be an angel of Yahweh, found her by a spring of water in the wilderness on the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? Great question. Where are you come from and where are you going? You could ask that question any day of our life. And she said, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. And the messenger said, go back to your mistress and submit to her harsh treatment. Well, messenger of God doesn't come off pretty good here either. In fact, he said, I will greatly increase your offspring, and there shall be too many to count. Behold, you are pregnant, and you will bear a son. You will call him Ishmael, for Yahweh has paid heed to your suffering. Again, you lose the pun in the English. His name is Yishmael, because Shama, heard or listened, a God, El. So, or in this case, the Hebrew God, Yahweh. So it's a play on the name. To be Yishmael means God listened. Again, this is an origin story for the name. But notice, she has to go back and suffer some more. The slave never leaves. He will be a wild ass of a person, which we think of as a bad attribute, but maybe this means courageous and bold. I mean, there's actually a name in Hebrew, Caleb is Kalev, it's dog. And we wouldn't think naming someone dog is a nice thing, but you know, dogs are loyal and can be strong and brave, and maybe that's a positive attribute. His hand against everyone, everyone against him, but he will dwell alongside all of his kin. And she called to Yahweh, who spoke to her, You are El Roi, by which she meant, Have I not gone on seeing after my being seen? And so the well was called Be'er Lahai Roi. So now we get the point of the story. It's an origin story for the name of the well. And who knows if that's the real story behind the name of the well, or it's the story they're telling to flesh out the Abraham saga. And so Hagar bore a son to Abram, and Abram gave the son that she bore the name Ishmael, or Ismail in the Arabic tradition. Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So he has an heir. He has a child. The covenant is being fulfilled. But wait, there's another covenant coming. And this is the one that will seal the deal for all time. When Abraham was 99 years old, by the way, if you do the math, how old is Ishmael at this point? He was 86 when Ishmael was born, and now he is 99. Ishmael is 13. An important age, right? He's having his bar mitzvah. No, probably not a bar mitzvah, but it is a coming of age in many cultures because of puberty. Yahweh appeared to Abraham and said to him, I am El Shaddai. I am the God Almighty, although Shaddai also means breasts, so who knows what the original meaning of this is. Walk in my ways and be blameless. The idea of following a path, or the halakha, the law of the God, is starting even this early in the narrative. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will make you exceedingly numerous. Again, a bargain, a deal. Abraham threw himself on his face, and God spoke further. So that's Abraham saying, okay, whatever you say. As for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the father of a multitude of nations, and you will no longer be called Abram. Here's the name change. You will no longer be called Abram, but your name shall be Avraham, for you will be a father of a multitude of nations. Now, why add that H in there? It does change the meaning. Avram means exalted father, but Avraham means father of a multitude. So now it's not just an exalted father maybe of one person. Now it's the father of the nation, the father of the peoples. And remember, what's the letter that shows up in that Yud He Vav He that's so important? It's the He. And so by adding the He in his name, it's also a sign of that preeminence of that God. And you'll notice also Sarah's name gets a tweak too. You will be a father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fertile, and make nations of you, and kings shall come forth from you. I will maintain my covenant between me and you and your offspring to come as an everlasting covenant. A Brit Olam, a permanent, eternal covenant throughout the ages to be God to you and to your offspring to come. No escape. It is a permanent covenant, but also no disqualification, right? This is a permanent promise. No matter how bad they get, I will still be their God, and they will still be my favored descendants of you. And this appears later in the Exodus where God is so fed up with the Hebrews after the golden calf, he wants to destroy them. And Moses says to him, well, remember, you promised their ancestors that you love them, and that was an irrevocable contract. You said you would be their God forever. And it works, and God relents. I assign the land you sojourn in, that you're staying in temporarily, to you and to your offspring to come, the whole land of Canaan, as an everlasting holding. Now that's also Ahuzat Olam, also an eternal possession. And this is where those fanatical right-wing settlers who claim this is their deed to the land, is that this was a permanent gift for the descendants of Abraham, and therefore cannot be rescinded, cannot be divided, cannot be given away, even for peace. And the deal is, I give you this land and I will be your God. Now later on, this will become a dilemma, because what if the Hebrews break the deal? What if they worship other gods? I mean, the deal was, I'll be their God, they get the land. Well, what if they worship other gods? Do I take the land away? Or do I take them away from the land and send them into exile? As for you, he says to Abraham, you and your offspring to come throughout the ages will keep my covenant. So now it's a two-way deal. Such shall be the covenant between me and you and your offspring to follow, which you shall keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. The unkindest cut. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and that shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. And throughout the generations, every male among you shall be circumcised at the age of 8 days. Why 8 days? If they made it alive a week, it was worth doing. As for the homeborn slave and the one bought from an outsider who is not of your offspring, they must be circumcised, homeborn and purchased alike. Thus shall my covenant be marked in your flesh as an everlasting pact. Now, this is a very serious covenant. Doing that kind of elective surgery was very risky in this time and place. And why that? Couldn't you take an earlobe or something else? Well, remember, the promise is fertility. And if the promise is fertility, maybe you have to make a sacrifice in the area of fertility that shows your faith. And so it may be the case that this is in fact a fertility rite to make a deal with the God for future offspring at the risk of the present. But the idea of this covenant to be marked in your flesh through the circumcision becomes a core ritual of baby welcoming in Jewish life. So much so that anybody who chooses not to circumcise their child gets looks from their family like they've done something horrific, even if they don't believe in a God who wants this kind of a bloody sacrifice anymore. They still feel like this is what you're supposed to do. By the way, remember that word for covenant, brit? If you pronounce that in Ashkenazi-style Hebrew, it would be bris. Just like Shabbat becomes Shabbos, that's where the word for a bris is. It means the covenant. It's an enactment of a covenant, going back to the story of Abraham. It also points out, if any male who is uncircumcised fails to circumcise the flesh of his foreskin, that person will be cut off from his kin. He has broken my covenant. This comes to play in the Hellenistic period, where some Jews try to hide their circumcision or even stop circumcising their sons to fit in better at the Greek gym, where they do naked athletics. The circumcision becomes an even more important symbol in that period. And God says to Abraham, as for your wife Sarai, do not call her Sarai. Her name is now Sarah, with the hay. Again, notice that hay. I will bless her. Indeed, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she shall give rise to nations. Rulers of people shall issue from her. Now Abraham throws himself on his face again, but this time he laughs. Vayitzchak. And he laughed. He said to himself, can a child be born to a man 100 years old? Or can Sarah bear a child at 90? But if you heard that name, Yitzchak, it's already there. He laughed about it. And God says, and so before that, Abraham remembers, oh yeah, I already have a son. Do I need Sarah to have a son? I have a son. Abraham said to God, may Ishmael live by your favor. Don't forget about Ishmael. He's my firstborn. God said, whatever you say, Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you will name him Yitzchak, after the laughter. and I will maintain my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring to come. As for Ishmael, I've heard you. And there's a pun here as well. So, L'Yishmael shamaticha. Again, I've heard you about the hearing one. I hereby bless him. I make him fertile and numerous. He will be the father of 12 chieftains, and I will make of him a great nation. So Ishmael will get his, but it won't be the core line of descent. It will be Abraham to Isaac, not Abraham to Ishmael. It's one of the reasons why the favored son to be sacrificed on the mountain is not Ishmael, according to the Hebrew Bible, it is Isaac. Of course, if you read the Quran, and Muslims claim descent from Ismail, it's Ismail who was almost sacrificed and not Isaac. Nevertheless, Ishmael received some of this covenant and promise, but the core covenant with Abraham will be passed down through Yitzchak, through Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year. Done speaking with him, God was gone from Abraham. Literally, it said he went up in this cosmology of gods in the heavens. And then Abraham took his son Ishmael and all his homeborn slaves and all those he had bought, again, all those people he had made, it says, every male in Abraham's household, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins on that very day as God had spoken to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he circumcised the flesh of his foreskin, and Yishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Thus were they circumcised on that very day. All the men of his households, all his slaves, all those who had been bought from outsiders were circumcised with him. Scholars speculate that this might actually be the echo of a former coming-of-age ceremony, long before the bar mitzvah came about. It may have been the case that the coming-of-age ritual was actually the circumcision. If you want an echo of this, you can recall the TV miniseries Roots, where in the first episode, where Kunta Kinte is growing up in his African nation, and the boys who come to a certain age are taken off into the woods for a coming-of-age rite. And one of the rites that takes place is a mass circumcision. As they say in the movie, the potos of a man looks different from the potos of a child. Well, thank goodness for our bar mitzvahs that they have modified that ritual. But for those who say that, circumcision is no big deal, I will point out that every baby that's circumcised can't walk for a year afterwards. It's a joke. Well, in any case, if you can't laugh about that, what can you? So this is the saga of Abraham, leaving his homeland, wandering all the way down to Egypt until he finds his way back, finally finding a territory that can be his near Hebron, and then receiving the promises of becoming a great nation, first to be cut in the flesh of animals, and ultimately to be cut in his own flesh and the flesh of his descendants. So with this, I'll stop talking, and I'm curious if you have any comments, questions, reactions, or thoughts about this early saga of Abraham, its prefiguration of later narratives and later events in Jewish history, and also its aspect of wish fulfillment for Jews living in a diaspora setting and aspiring to someday return to what they consider their promised land.